Good afternoon. I am so glad that everyone could come today. My name is Dr. Nathan Tai, as many of you already know, as I see many regular faces to our Brown Bag series. Thank you all for being here today. This is the June edition of our monthly Brown Bag series, hosted in conjunction with the Kearney Public Library, which we are very, very thankful for. One of the true treasures here in the kind of Kearney cultural landscape. We have a couple of upcoming talks. And as you all know, it's the 150th anniversary of Kearney this year, and we have many events happening throughout the summer. And so our next talk is going to be part of that. It is a talk that I am doing. There's going to be some mild criticism of Kearney said here. Bankers, brothels, and a baseball great, three tales from 1890s Kearney. So if you want to find out why the mayor is pulled out of the brothel by the county sheriff in 1894, he's very, very intoxicated. It's all over the hub. It's really funny. Do come to that talk. In August, the date and time we're still working at, we're tentatively going to be having a visiting scholar from University of California, Santa Barbara, Donna Anderson, who's actually from Omaha, but is a scholar on Asian American communities in the Midwest. And so she's tentatively agreed. We just got to figure out when she's going to be in town. And then in September already, September 13th, Dr. Torsten Homburger from the UNK History Department is going to be discussing his most recent research into the young pioneers in East Germany. So these are the communist version of the Boy Scouts, and kind of his research into that. We have other events that are going to be upcoming. I also highly recommend looking. There's a lot of events happening here at the library, as well as through Buffalo County Historical Society and the History Department, as well as part of the 150th anniversary celebrations that are going to be happening all throughout the summer. But today, and this is also part of this, is Extinct Education, Nebraska's Rural School Past. Our speaker today is Professor Laurinda Weisse, who is the University Archivist and Digital Repository Manager at UNK. She's also, they're also an associate professor in the library. They're in charge of the UNK Special Collections, the UNK Archives, as well as OpenSPACES, which is the university's digital repository. Professor Weisse's research is varied and includes co-founding the Coming to the Plains project, with some of you might have seen that documentary and exhibit when it was at the World Theater, and as well as current research examining 1890s Omaha through the lens of a shooting and contextualizing the collaborates community groups and the care for archival material, which is projects that are currently ongoing. But we're very, very excited. So Professor Weisse, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And thanks for having me. I'm here to talk a little bit today about Nebraska's rural school past. And obviously we use extinct. We know that there are still a lot of rural schools out there, but we'll talk specifically about the move away from one room or only elementary education districts. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of the history of education in Nebraska, and then we'll talk about the Country School Legacy Project, where we're drawing some of the data from, as well as give you all a peek at a lot of the Buffalo County schools that we recorded. So Nebraska's first school, understandably, was at Fort Atkinson about 1819. And we know this because we have the ledger from the fort showing that a soldier was paid 15 cents per student per day to teach classes. So great incentive to get the kids to come to school when you're getting paid per head. We also have notes from various diaries and journals. So George Kennerly notes that he took his girl up to the garrison for school, which also lets us know that we have both boys and girls being educated at that point in time. And obviously, schools continue to expand as the Euro-American colonization of Nebraska does. As folks start moving into the western part of the state, we see an expansion of schools as well. But sticking with the eastern side of the state, this is Nebraska's oldest still standing school. So this school was built in 1857 and operates up through 1964. So it had a pretty good run. It started life by a town that's no longer in existence, Omadi, and ended up in Homer, Nebraska, just a bit south of Dakota City. So it was moved a couple of times before it landed there. And like a lot of schools, it's now being used as a living history and history of education facility where the local kids come and reenact an idealized version of late 1800s or early 1900s education. Probably they don't make it authentic with outhouses and snakes and things like that. We do hear a lot of complaints when we look at our building files that I'll talk about more later of snakes in the outhouses especially, and wasps and skunks and so on and so forth. So who knew going to the bathroom could be that hazardous? So Nebraska has valued education from its early days. In 1855, the territorial governor puts out this statement as part of a broader State of the Territory address. So the institution of learning, which in our country underlies all others, is the common school. By its means, the poor man is put upon an equality with the rich, and ample resources of education are afforded alike to the occupant of the stately mansion and of the squatter's cabin. No community can remain virtuous, happy, or prosperous if destitute of the means of education. And he goes on to suggest that a general fund be created, taxing property in the state for the support of schools. He's really getting at and articulating really early the value that was placed on education in Nebraska, not just as a means of creating an educated community, but also as a way of trying to support the, again, idealized American dream of equality and that everybody deserves the same resources. And we see this value hold somewhat towards the future. So by 1864, we have the beginning of discussions for how you might fund schools in a more systematic manner. And this is drawing on federal law, and it sets aside the 16th and 36th sections or their equivalents if the land had already been claimed, mostly relevant to the eastern part of the state, for support of the schools. And this goes on to be enacted when Nebraska becomes a state in 1867, and about 1/18 of the land of Nebraska is set aside for the support of common schools. So this is just your general public school system. Like a lot of land dealings and land-related things, this goes better in the ideal than it does in the practical. So you see a lot of land speculation, a lot of embezzlement of the funds that were meant for the support of schools, and all sorts of other shenanigans going on with this funding. It was a quick and easy funding source, still a fledgling government without a lot of enforcement provisions, so on and so forth. So by 1897, they've tried a couple of times to address this in the legislature, and they come up with the state of Nebraska has accepted from the United States this land endowment for future schools as a sacred trust. And this forms the basis of the Nebraska School Land Trust, which is still in existence today and still provides some of the funding for schools in Nebraska. So they do eventually get it straightened out where schools actually get some of the money that they were promised. And this is a huge help in expanding education in Nebraska. Some of y'all have certainly lived through waves of consolidation. So in 1918, Nebraska has about 7,000 one-room schools, and it has a lot more 2 or more room schoolhouses. So it's safe to assume at this point, the bulk of children in Nebraska are being educated in these small rural schools. This is certainly something we see played out that goes along with the professionalization of teaching. So as the normal school, UNK was responsible for education of teachers. And the early correspondence with the president in this time period is repeatedly sending out our juniors and our underclassmen because we've placed all of the seniors already. So there was more of a demand for teachers than there was a supply at that point. And this is even with our standards for teaching being on the lower side. So maybe you would have gone to high school. At this point in 1918, we're starting to see requirements for having at least done a summer session and having a little bit of a teaching license. Obviously, this gets stricter as time goes on, but even up to when we're doing some of the oral histories that were done in the 1980s, we see folks that were grandfathered in and we're still teaching with these certificates rather than having what we consider the education for a teacher these days. So in 1949, Nebraska passes the Reorganization of School Districts Act. And this starts one wave of consolidations in the 1950s. Obviously, this also coincides with the baby boom. So it seems like a little bit of a strange time to be condensing the number of schools. It was partly an artifact of funding, as well as how we thought about schools and what kind of experience we wanted students to have. So by 1980, we're hitting another wave of consolidations. 1984, we have 666 districts that only offer elementary education. So these might be one-room schoolhouses, they might be a couple rooms. We'll see examples of both. But what was really critical here is these districts are only offering elementary education. The advantage, of course, is that these schools are close to the children and you're getting very personalized education. So by 1986, we have 385 one-room schoolhouses. And then we see another huge wave of consolidations until elementary-only districts end in 2005, 2006, with a total of 206 districts. Obviously, this is what leads to a lot of our consolidated districts. And we trade more class offerings for busing and a longer commute to schools and less locally embedded schools. We'll talk a little bit about some of the implications of this and what some of the advantages of these little schools were. So that brings me to the Country School Legacy Humanities on the Frontier. This was a project that was done in 1980 with a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. There were 8 states, primarily Great Plains, some in our neighbors to the west, that collected a variety of materials. And it was really seen, especially in Nebraska, that since we had 40% of the country's rural schools at the time, while we were already seeing the writing on the wall with this consolidation, but we really wanted to capture what had gone on. So the goal was to talk to both students and teachers at the rural schools and find out both about the ones that had existed in the past, as well as ones that were still going strong when this was done. There are a couple caveats here. It covers most of the state, but it is not a comprehensive listing of schools. They sent out questionnaires and flyers to primarily school districts. So if school districts didn't have the time or didn't have anyone with the knowledge, if they had a lot of recent turnover, they mostly didn't return the forms. So it's a decent look at schools and education in Nebraska, but there are a lot of gaps. And this is something that we'd love to go and develop further, because we know that there are a lot of omissions here. Also collected at the same time were oral histories, as well as building files, which give you the nitty-gritty details if you want to know the dimensions of the schools, what type of construction they were, if they had had their roof replaced. Very exciting things, but really important from an architectural standpoint. I find it more interesting, though, that a lot of times longtime residents of the area submitted stories of the schools along with the building files. And we'll be looking at some of the data from those building files a little bit later. The oral histories collected were done by a variety of people. UNKs were done primarily through the English department by Professor Ernest Grundy. He certainly had a strong interest in the topic, but certainly had his own biases and perspectives and interests showed through in the oral histories. We have one or two women who don't have first names because he didn't bother to get their first names, even though they were the ones who were the primary interviewees. So we work with what we have, and this is a problem with all oral histories, is everybody goes in with their own interests and perspectives. So I'll be sharing a few of these oral histories a little bit later with y'all, and some of them really just give fantastic information. So we're going to take a look at a few strands that I've pulled out from these oral histories. One of these themes is hazards. As we all know, there's a lot more ways that things can go wrong when you are at an isolated country school versus in a city or in a developed town. And one thing that was a little bit surprising to me is how late some of the impacts of these disasters, natural, human-made, etc., continue. So, I know this text is a little small, and I apologize for that. This section talks about the West Emmerich School and the flooding that went on there. So, just as a heads up, 3 children did die during this flooding, and I am going to read an excerpt. It's not too gory. But the school had been built kind of between 2 ravines that were usually dry. They were not dry when this took place, obviously. So I'm going to share the remembrances of Ernest McIntosh, who wrote these down in 1936. So it had been flooding for days, it had been raining for days and days. When it came time for the afternoon recess, the schoolhouse was in the middle of a channel of water, nearly 1/4 mile wide, and it was coming into the building. Fred Miles, Bert Homan, and myself were about the same size. We got in one corner to talk things over. We thought the house was going to float off before very long, if the water should keep rising. There was an attic in the house, and Bert and I proposed we all get up there. But Fred decided against this, as he said if it should tip over, we would all drown. We then agreed to get to Bert's house and went to the door and quietly passed out. The water at the time was about waist deep. So you can see where this is going to become a bad situation very quickly. We did not get far north until we ran into a channel that was over our heads. We were all thrown down and floundered around for what seemed to be a long time. I finally got on my feet, but Fred and Bert were on the opposite side of the channel. They could not cross to where I was and would have to go the other way. I remember distinctly Fred waving his hand and saying, "Goodbye, Ern." His body was found about a mile from there sometime later after the water had gone down. Bert managed to keep his head above the water and drifted with the stream until he came close to a windmill tower and caught onto it and climbed to the top and stayed there until help arrived. I went north to a straw stack and stayed until my parents came for me. The other 2 children were lost when the teacher tries to evacuate the school. It was too late for that at that point, and the smaller children were starting to float away by the time that they were trying to walk away from the school. So one little child started to get carried away, another child tried to save her, and they were both swept away by the flooding. So the Red Cloud chief notes that these children were drowned and shares some of the details of this. And this is one of a very unfortunate occurrence. Obviously, with what we know about floods now, maybe we wouldn't have tried to leave the school, but if you think the school's going to float away, you don't really have any good choices. But we still have some of these issues well into the 1960s. And this is from North Star School. Thankfully, there were no children in this school when this happened. they got about 14 inches of rain, and the schoolhouse moves right onto the road. So, you never know where your school building's going to end up. And the road remained blocked for the summer as it took the bridge out as well, but it was eventually put back on the foundation about 30 feet closer to the creek. As the huge cottonwoods on the playground were considered a hazard to the building. Again, trade-offs. Do you want your building swept away again, or do you want the trees to fall on it? Your choice. And I believe this building was still intact, though no longer used for a school when this was discussed. Nebraska, so we always have the opposite issue as well of fire. In the top, we have a reminiscence from the Snowball School. In the late 80s, there was a prairie fire, 1880s obviously. There was a fire originating on the farm, and the teachers sent the pupils out to the plowed ground south of the schoolhouse and ordered them to lie face down. They still breathed lots of the smoke since the grass was tall and the smoke was dense. I'm going to play for you the reminiscences of Vinda Russell Phillips, who discusses the other sort of fire that was a problem with schools. And that was directly related to the heating of the schools.
One real cold day, I remember that I was standing by the stove stirring the soup, and all of a sudden, little Robert Sumner says, "Oh, teacher, your dress is on fire." So I looked down, and I had on a wool jumper, and it was all scorched way up high on one side, but it didn't start blazing. But I had always been strict about the kids talking without permission or holding up their hands, but that was one time it worked out all right for Robert to let me know about it. I don't know, I just wonder if he remembers that.
So as Vinda recounts in this fairly entertaining story, wear wool if you're going to be by a fire, but the teachers were having to deal with fire sources. It was generally in the contract that they were the ones that had to stoke the fire in the mornings, and the sources of heat in these schools were really widely varied. Sometimes it was wood, sometimes coal, corn cobs. In the older schools, mostly before the time of these reminiscence, dried cow patties. So you had some options. Basically, whatever could be burned, you burned. But that led to incidents like this, as well as a number of cases where the schools burned down. Normally, it was when the fire was stoked and the children weren't in it, but there were quite a few of the early schoolhouses that were lost to fire. And that wouldn't have been uncommon for homes in the area either. One that probably most of y'all as Nebraskans have heard about is the blizzard of 1888. And this one's also called the School Children's Blizzard. And this is one that's even been remembered in song. So we have the Song of the Great Blizzard of 1888. I'll leave this out for show and tell later. That recounts one school teacher's journey to evacuate the students from her school and get them to safety. And we have a few other reminiscences here, primarily from Saunders County. So the blizzard of 1888 caught the teacher and pupils in the school for 12 hours before help came. The older pupils had spelldowns, ciphering, and so on to pass the time. The younger pupils cried. It was the first time they were ever away from home. And obviously it was a never to be forgotten incident. They were lucky that they must have had a nice solid schoolhouse, because hunkering down wasn't really an option for a lot of children who were caught at the schools, as some of these other accounts lay out. So at this school, a hired man went to fetch the kids, and it would have generally been all the kids trying to get to the closest house. But there was no way they were going to make it back to the house. So he upset the bobsled and put all the children and the teacher under the sled. And then they all walked around. And unfortunately, the mules that he had brought with him did not survive. So this lays it out in more detail. Parts that I took out as well recount how the mules were let run for home, but nobody knew they were running for home, so they didn't take the bridles off. And that didn't go so well for the poor mules. But the children all survived. The hired man, his fingers weren't so great afterwards, a little bit of frostbite, but they did manage to get the children safely home. And that's similar to the account from West School in Antelope County, where a neighbor came and picked up both his kids and all the other kids in the school. So you can see, despite these hazards, the communities, or because of these hazards, the community really was pulling together and making sure that everybody was cared for. And that continues with more modern blizzards. So this is Gwendolyn Wilman Schroeder, and she talks a little bit about when she was dealing with blizzards, I believe the 1960s. We are crossing the border to Colorado. So this isn't strictly a Nebraska story, but.
Beautiful. It had snowed, it must have been 4 or 5 inches deep, and then it crested on top. And you'd walk on top, and I think the cattle walked on top. And I thought, well, maybe it'll melt today. That was in November. And we went to school, and the wind came up. And I thought it was going to blow the schoolhouse to pieces. And it blew the snow and drifted it, and we didn't get home till way late. It must have been close to midnight when my husband came after me. And I took 2 pupils home with me because I didn't want to leave them in the schoolhouse, and I just took them with me. We took them home. And that was one experience we had with the blizzard.
Now you had another one where you stayed all night at school, right?
Yeah, and then later, well, that was later. Yeah, it was later. Another year, we were at the schoolhouse, and it began to snow, and we had to stay all night at the schoolhouse. But we did pretty good. We all napped.
You weren't scared.
No,
And
I didn't have very many people. I think there was only 4 that day.
Oh, wow. And this was Lone Star School?
This was Lone Star School in, well, yeah.
So obviously teachers are dealing with blizzards in creative ways, taking your pupils home with you in some instances. Obviously that's not something in a modern context that reads quite the same as it did back in the time. But you also didn't want to be leaving the kids in the school. The other major hazard, and since we're in this, I will pop back to the slideshow in a moment, but we'll play these first, was disease. So these schools were way out in the country in most cases, and a lot of them didn't have great water supplies. So they would either bring water from neighboring farms, had cisterns, and other things. But even once the water was in the school, there was the shared bucket and a shared dipper, with all children drinking from the same area. So this leads, of course, to some things with disease. So Violet Kelso is going to tell us a little bit about how she and her sister got typhoid from the water at school.
By the way, they had a cistern, and my sister and I both were victims of typhoid fever when we were going to that school, and it was found that there was a dead rabbit in that cistern. And that was the reason for our typhoid fever. And that, I don't know whether they depended on the rainwater for that cistern or what, or whether they filled it. It was too small, but I do know that was their diagnosis at the well that we took right now, that's they've read it.
Goodness.
We both nearly died, but we was the only two that took it.
Do you remember what the heating was like in that school?
So obviously, thankfully, we generally don't have rabbits in our water now. We hope. Or at least we boil it thoroughly before we use it. It was also really common, close quarters, to pick up other diseases. So this is Goldie Ewing Wilson Bixby talking about some of the diseases that ran through her school.
We expected to have a disease going around here, and school would be dismissed for a couple of 3 weeks while we had the measles and the chicken pox and the smallpox and even diphtheria. And perhaps that was the contributor to that factor. But let's see, then we would.
So it was certainly an interesting experience with a lot that could go wrong. But you also had the community responding as a community. And you see this both with things like how they responded to natural disasters and hazards, and also how the communities would chip in to improve things like the cisterns and the water supply, making sure that some of the schools got wells, so on and so forth, to make the experience a little bit better for the students. These were also community hubs. So they didn't just function as schools, but they functioned as de facto community centers. And they even had responses to community events. So New Lisbon School became known as Snowball School because the students built a giant snow fort and pelted the passing horses and teams with the snowballs. And they also recount how a huge snowman had to be torn down when William Brett's team refused to go by it. So honestly, we're getting a little bit more snow back then. I don't think a snow fort would have quite the same impact that it does as it would today. But we also had some interesting occurrences, like this one at Stringtown School. So a boy ran a barbed wire into his throat while coasting down a steep hill west of the school building. The pupils fastened the two barbed wires together so we could coast under for a longer ride. The wires came loose. But the same boy was also bitten by a rattlesnake at school. Maybe the boy was being a little bit too adventurous. But they do note that at the time of the writing of this, the man was 80 years old, so no lasting harm for those incidents. And that particular account, all of which is available online if you want to read, has a bunch more of those little kind of occurrences that go on. So kids being kids, and it's great when you can capture that kind of remembrance in addition to the darker ones that we talked about a little bit earlier. This also recounts some of the ways in which communities engaged with their schools. So District 70 in Saunders County had the Moonlight Social Club, very fancy. Most families belonged, and every third Tuesday evening each month, they met in the homes, children included. There was always a short program, lunch served by the hostess, and lots of visiting. And this came to meet in the schoolhouse as the group became too large. It eventually becomes what the group that does the Christmas and spring pageants is. So it's a great way of showing how the school is serving as a community hub. This is even more so the case when you look at District 82, that it was widely used for community gatherings, various league meetings, Grange meetings, polling center, and during World War I served as a meeting place for the Home Guard. It was not unusual to see the Guard pacing up and down the school while executing brisk hand salutes. I'm sure the children were delighted in copying those hand salutes all the time as well. And these stories are really common. This was pretty typical. If you think about when this land was originally settled by Euro-American colonists, you would have often chosen to live with people that were similar to you in some regard. So a lot of times the schools are also serving as churches on the weekends and for a whole variety of other activities. Because you were generally legally required to build this school and provide the school building, but you might as well use it for everything else as well. And this is just a shot I love. This was taken in 1980 when they were doing the collection for the Country School Legacy of District 75 near Hastings. So this was, I believe, a two-teacher school, but they were still keeping the kids busy with arithmetic on the chalkboard. So we'll transition into the Buffalo County schools. So how many of y'all attended a rural school in Nebraska? Awesome, a lot of you. How many of you attended a rural school here in Buffalo County? Awesome. So you may recognize some of these buildings. As I said, I can't promise this is a complete record. So I'm happy to talk with folks later if y'all have additions or corrections. I'm just drawing on what was left for me. So here we have a school that was just north of Ravenna that's now used just for voting. I say now, in 1980. Probably now not used for much, if it exists at all. If any of you recognize these and know if they exist, though, please come talk to me afterwards, as we're curious. Green Hill School. So this obviously had enough teachers that they added a trailer on, and presumably had more than one teacher since they're specifying the head teacher. Alfalfa Center School. District 83, I don't know if this one had a colloquial name or not, but all we had in records was that. I do kind of love, if you look closely at the picture of the outhouse, you can just see boys are. You don't know what boys are. And if this was the boys' outhouse or the girls' outhouse that had such inscriptions, this school did have separate boys and girls' outhouses. So we know that much, but, and it was actually noted that the school was in good condition despite the way the paint job looks on it. And this is District 80. They do note that they mow the whole yard before school starts. So this is July. It obviously looks mildly haunted. There's a whole set of play equipment. And you have Ernest Grundy, who is the head of the project, in the entrance to the school, rocking some lovely print bell bottoms there. In this school, we have a lot of pictures of as well. So if you're interested, I'm happy to show y'all where those pictures are. He even documented the cattle that were around the school. Angus, if you're curious. This was Carr School near Shelton, for some definition of near. Stone School, the old one and the new one. Again, new, 1980. The Hartman School that had just been discontinued when this was taken. Center School. Probably most of y'all have been in this one. This is the Given School that's now at the Stewart Museum, obviously used as another living learning space. Glenwood, again, old and new. Pleasant Hill. So, and before I set y'all loose for questions and to come look at some of what we have with us today, brought a few items from our archives that y'all are welcome to come look at. So we have a variety of textbooks that would have been used at the time. So we have your classic reader for reading and English kind of stuff. And these date from between 1910 and about 1955. Some of y'all might recognize these. We have some arithmetic books, as well as some really interesting ones as we get into the 40s and 50s. And you can see where things like insects, friends and foes, would be particularly of interest for rural kids who are probably going to have a stronger tie to farming or other things with the land. And then the air about us. We also have some great collections. This collection has materials that were both used by a teacher and some of her materials from when she attended school. So it's rare that you get to see your teacher's letters of recommendation and transcripts along with what they actually taught. And then we also have the Oscar Jensen Rural School Collection that was from here in Buffalo County. So afterwards, that reminds me I have one more oral history to torture you with that ties in, that's pretty great. And then I will let you all take a look. So this is a student giving a report on one of their field trips.
Of the last year. The first one was a field trip on pollution, and here is Terry to speak on that. Terry?
Hi, I'm Terry, and I'm 13 years old. I'm going to tell you about our first field trip. We went to the Niagara River, about 3/4 miles from here. We ate there, and then we had a discussion on pollution. We found all kinds of pollution all around the river. We thought of all the ways that pollution hurts country all around us. We saw some trash coming down the river. Then we looked at some of the fish that live around there. When we ate lunch, one of the students threw an orange peel into the river. She said it wouldn't hurt anything, but Miss Bartosh said it would. She went after it a little ways down the river and finally caught it. And then we find out that if everybody put their trash in the river, there wouldn't be any more river for us to go to. Then we went back to the schoolhouse and saw the pollution in the roads and ditches. We really enjoyed the walk.
Okay, thanks, Terry. Also on that one return trip on pollution, we each picked up as many pieces as we could and made collages of them when we got back. And then finally did away with our rubbish. All right, next to speak.
So this is one of the great examples of one of the awesome benefits of these rural schools is you have the children able to just stroll out of school, walk down to the river, take a look at what's going on, and make observations about their local environment. And this is a time where we have, from the mid-1970s, we have our students here at, when it was Kearney State College, doing reports on how a lot of these smaller waterways are completely dead. So it's an area of huge interest and concern, and the students are getting to relate those bigger concerns with what's going on around them. With that, are there any questions from y'all? Connie?
When did teachers get the requirement of a 4-year degree? Was that a gradual process?
Yeah, I'd have to do a little bit of looking to confirm for sure, but up into the 1980s, you still had teachers who were grandfathered in that just had a lifetime certificate. But it's 1950s, 1960s that you start seeing more requirements for formal education from the teachers.
And that goes hand in hand with requiring students to attend high school?
Yeah. Yeah, because obviously you don't want your students to be more educated than your teachers. I mean, they might be quicker anyway, but keeping discipline would be a little challenging if your students are more educated than you are. And this is also, as we go forth, you start seeing requirements for continuing education as well. And that ties in with a lot of broader nationwide trends in addition. Go ahead.
How did they acquire the certificate? Was it done by an exam?
Yeah, so the certificate was a little bit complicated. So you could either do exams or it was some combination of education plus exam. So for example, back in the 1910s, a lot of teachers would come for a summer session here in Kearney, and they would get a temporary teaching certificate. And then if they completed X number of summer sessions or summer plus a semester or two, they could get a lifetime certificate. So it was a combination of some education and testing. But earlier, you would have just the testing. And it would be equivalent to testing to the GED, kind of. So you'd be basically proving that you had a high school level education. Obviously, that wasn't the case early on, that there was a high school level education requirement. Since you see a lot of 16, 17, 18-year-olds teaching as well.
So how was the exam administered? Was it done at the County Board of Education or how?
Yeah, so that one was set at the county. We actually have some stories in these oral histories where you showed up at some guy's house. He had the papers, you filled out the papers, you sent them in to be graded at a county or a state level, and then they let you know whether you passed or not. So it was pretty loosey-goosey early on. Obviously, by the 1900s, it was generally a little bit more formalized. That particular story is from the very early years of education in Nebraska. Dr. Ty.
So if you have school records or stories and you would like to contribute them for stuff, where should you go?
Yeah, thanks for that question. The UNK Archives collects history of education as one of our main collecting areas. So we're happy to work with you to either place the records if you're physically looking to donate them, or we can collaborate on digitization where we do some scanning, maybe add the digital versions to our online portal while you hang on to the physical ones. We're also happy to sit down with any of y'all and do oral histories if you all want to share your education experiences, either teaching or learning with us. Yeah.
At what point were married teachers allowed? Do you know how that changed? Because I know the rural school I went to, I'm sure after first grade that teacher left because she was getting married and another Miss teacher came in.
Yeah.
So I'm curious when that happened.
Absolutely. And this is another that varies district by district. I have a teaching contract from here in Buffalo County that is from the 1950s that still had the get married, get fired provision in it. And this, obviously, as you heard in some of the oral histories, some of the women that gave their stories are married, and most of these are talking about 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s.
You know, the interesting thing about that was our rural school was unmarried, but when we went to the public school, then the next year, there were married teachers there in the town public school, but not in the rural school.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see a lot of
racist, right?
And we'd also see a lot of what we might call morality clauses in contracts. So that some of them had quite the laundry list of things you could and couldn't do in your free time as well. This might also be why there was a teacher shortage. Perhaps, especially in the early years. But I think we're seeing the change more in I would say probably most of those clauses are gone by the late 50s, early 60s at the latest. And I think it might be a little different if they were desperate for a teacher and you were married to someone locally versus having someone that came in and then got married. So I think there might have also kind of been that sort of division as well. Yeah.
My dad got a 1-year certificate from Kearney Normal School or whatever it was called, but I have no record of where he went to teach in a one-room schoolhouse.
Sure.
Is there any kind of a record of that?
Yes and no. For some years there is. So depending on what years, there might be. So in our earliest years, a lot of that is kept in correspondence in the president's files. Unfortunately, we don't have president's files much past 1920-ish. And then we do have 1919 and 1920, we have placement files. And the placement files were great because they had to fill out a fairly standardized thing with everything from what classes you had taken, definitely relevant, to height, weight, religion, everything else you can think of. So, and they do note on some of those where those students or former students were placed. So I'm happy to give you my information and we can talk about whether we might have information on that as well.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you, when the county superintendent's office were all gotten rid of,
Mhm.
more or less with consultant, did you receive a lot of their records?
No.
Okay.
I do know that there are certainly some at BCHS. There are a lot of the Kearney ones, and I think probably some from districts that were closed is still in the possession of the school district. So that's an ongoing conversation. We're in the middle of a renovation, so trying not to bring in any giant collections, but that's something that we're working with, starting to talk with the district about transferring some of those over to us. But if any of y'all have ideas where some of those things ended up, especially if they're not already in the care of a cultural heritage organization, I'm happy to work with folks on getting those to a place where they can be used and appreciated. Other questions? All right. Well, thank you all so much for your, oops, did I miss one? Okay. Well, with that, you're welcome to come talk to me afterwards. I'll leave my contact information as I slur together those things up on the screen. And you're welcome to come take a look at some of the artifacts we've brought with us from the UNK Archives.